Corporate told me my franchise agreements were being terminated due to performance metrics that indicate a change is needed. My name is Edwin Palmer, 56 years old, franchise owner with 21 years of exemplary service running 3 profitable restaurant locations. I had built my territory from a single struggling location to 3 thriving establishments generating $2.8 million annually, consistently ranking in the top 5% nationally for profitability and compliance. When Regional Manager Rick Davidson called to inform me that my territory was being revoked to make room for fresh leadership and new perspectives, I simply said, "I understand the company's position." What they didn't realize was that as a former corporate auditor, I maintained comprehensive documentation of every franchise communication, policy change, and performance metric that revealed their systematic pattern of targeting veteran owners. The call came on a Thursday morning while I was reviewing quarterly reports that showed my locations had exceeded corporate benchmarks by 23% for the 6th consecutive quarter. Rick's voice carried the tone of someone delivering a rehearsed script. "Edwin, after careful review of your operational performance and market positioning, corporate has decided to restructure your territory. Your franchise agreements will not be renewed when they expire next month." I set down my coffee and reached for my recording device. What specific performance issues triggered this decision? Multiple factors contributed to this determination: customer satisfaction scores, operational efficiency metrics, and alignment with corporate strategic initiatives all played a role in the evaluation process. The language was corporate doublespeak, but I recognized the pattern from my auditing days. Rick was reading from prepared talking points designed to sound official while avoiding specific factual claims. "I see. And who will be taking over the territory?" "Corporate has identified a qualified candidate who will bring fresh energy and innovative approaches to the market. The transition process will begin immediately to ensure continuity of operations." I thanked Rick for the notification and ended the call. Then I walked to my office safe and retrieved the folders labeled Franchise Documentation Master Files. For the past 2 years, I had been tracking unusual patterns in corporate communications and policy changes, small modifications to evaluation criteria that seemed designed to create grounds for franchise terminations, new performance metrics that weren't in our original agreements, subtle changes to renewal requirements that gave corporate more discretionary power. My auditing background had taught me that institutional changes rarely happen randomly. When organizations modify long-standing policies, there's usually a strategic reason that benefits someone at the decision-making level. I opened my laptop and began reviewing the franchise performance data I maintained independently of corporate systems. Every location I operated was documented with detailed financial records, customer feedback analysis, and operational compliance reports. What I found confirmed my suspicions about corporate's real motivations. My 3 locations had generated $2.8 million in revenue over the past 12 months, with profit margins that exceeded corporate averages by 31%. Customer satisfaction scores placed me in the top 3% of all franchisees nationwide. Health department inspections had resulted in perfect scores for 18 consecutive months. According to every measurable standard in our franchise agreements, my performance warranted automatic renewal with territorial protection guarantees. I pulled out the renewal documents I had received from corporate 6 months earlier. The language had been subtly modified from previous years, new clauses about market optimization and strategic realignment that weren't in my original agreements. Most concerning was a section about performance evaluation flexibility that gave corporate broader discretion in interpreting compliance standards. I called my attorney, Margaret Chen, who had handled franchise legal issues for multiple restaurant owners in our region. "Margaret, I need you to review some documents regarding my franchise termination. I think corporate may be using fabricated performance issues to justify seizing profitable territories." She agreed to meet that afternoon. I spent the remaining morning hours organizing financial records, correspondence, and policy documentation that I had maintained throughout my franchise relationship. The patterns were becoming clearer with each document I reviewed. Corporate had been systematically changing evaluation criteria to create grounds for terminating successful long-term franchisees. The modifications were subtle enough to avoid obvious legal challenges, but comprehensive enough to give them flexibility in justifying decisions that benefited their preferred candidates. Margaret's initial review confirmed the legal problems with corporate's approach. Edwin, your franchise agreements explicitly guarantee renewal rights based on performance standards that you've consistently exceeded. If they're terminating you despite meeting all contractual requirements, they're breaching fundamental terms of your agreements. She examined the modified renewal language that corporate had introduced. These changes to evaluation criteria appear to be retroactive policy modifications that weren't part of your original contracts. That's potentially fraudulent business practice. But the most significant issue was the pattern of selective enforcement that suggested systematic discrimination against veteran franchisees. If corporate is applying these new standards selectively to target long-term owners while exempting other franchisees, that could constitute conspiracy to defraud and violation of franchise disclosure regulations. Margaret recommended consulting with specialists in franchise law and federal business regulations. She also suggested investigating whether other franchisees had experienced similar treatment. If this is happening to multiple owners, we might be looking at class action territory rather than individual breach of contract. I spent the next week making discreet inquiries among fellow franchisees in neighboring territories. What I discovered was more extensive than I had initially suspected. Have you ever uncovered evidence that an organization you trusted was systematically betraying multiple people using the same deceptive methods? The pattern reveals not just individual wrongdoing, but institutional corruption designed to exploit loyal partners. My investigation into corporate's termination patterns revealed a systematic scheme targeting the most successful veteran franchisees across multiple regions. Over 18 months, corporate had terminated 47 high-performing owners who collectively represented over $45 million in franchise territory value. The conversations with displaced franchisees followed remarkably similar scripts. Performance metrics that had been excellent for years were suddenly deemed insufficient. Renewal agreements that had been routinely approved were rejected for vague, strategic reasons. Territories that had generated consistent profits were reassigned to candidates with connections to corporate management. Tom Rodriguez, who had operated 5 locations in Arizona for 19 years, described his termination meeting with corporate executives. They told me my customer satisfaction scores weren't meeting new standards, but I had the highest ratings in my region for 3 consecutive years. When I asked to see the specific data they were referencing, they said it was proprietary information that couldn't be shared. Linda Morrison, a 15-year franchisee from Nevada, experienced identical treatment. Corporate claimed my operational compliance was substandard, but I had passed every inspection and audit for over a decade. They refused to provide documentation of the alleged violations or explain what compliance failures they were referencing. The pattern was unmistakable. Corporate was using fabricated performance issues to justify terminations that had nothing to do with actual business metrics. But the most revealing aspect was discovering who was receiving the seized territories. Rick Davidson's son, Michael, had been awarded my 3 locations. Despite having no restaurant experience and no franchise industry background, his qualifications consisted of a college degree and family connections to regional management. Tom Rodriguez's Arizona territory went to the nephew of corporate vice president Sarah Mitchell. Linda Morrison's Nevada locations were reassigned to the brother-in-law of regional director James Park. Corporate was essentially transferring valuable franchise territories from successful veteran owners to relatives and friends of executives, using fabricated performance evaluations to justify theft of established businesses. The financial analysis I conducted revealed the scope of corporate's scheme. Veteran franchisees who were terminated had paid an average of $180,000 in initial franchise fees, plus ongoing royalties and marketing contributions that totaled approximately $45,000 annually per location. Their combined territories represented over $45 million in established business value. By terminating these owners and reassigning territories to insider candidates, Corporate avoided paying the renewal incentives and territorial protection guarantees that veteran franchisees had earned through successful performance. The insider recipients received established, profitable territories without paying the full franchise fees or meeting the performance standards that the original owners had exceeded for decades. Corporate's internal savings from this scheme exceeded $8. $3 million in avoided renewal payments, while the transferred franchise value benefited executive families by over $45 million. This wasn't just individual fraud, it was systematic conspiracy to defraud veteran franchisees while enriching corporate insiders through theft of established business territories. I contacted Margaret Chen with my findings and requested an immediate meeting to discuss class action litigation options. Margaret, I've documented a pattern of systematic franchise terminations affecting 47 veteran owners across 12 states. Corporate has been using fabricated performance evaluations to seize valuable territories for relatives and friends of executives. Her response was immediate and decisive. Edwin, if you can prove systematic fraud affecting multiple franchisees using identical deceptive methods, we have grounds for federal class action litigation under franchise disclosure regulations and conspiracy to defraud statutes. She referred me to David Kim, a specialist in franchise litigation who had successfully prosecuted similar cases against major corporations. Kim's initial review of my documentation confirmed the strength of our potential case. This is one of the most comprehensive franchise fraud schemes I've encountered. The systematic nature of the terminations, combined with the clear pattern of insider benefit, creates multiple federal violations that carry severe penalties. He explained the legal framework that would govern our litigation. Franchise disclosure regulations require companies to provide accurate performance data and apply evaluation criteria consistently across all franchisees. If they're using fabricated metrics and selective enforcement to benefit insiders, they've violated fundamental securities and business fraud statutes. The Federal Trade Commission had specific jurisdiction over franchise disclosure violations, while state attorneys general could pursue criminal charges for fraudulent business practices that crossed state lines. We'll file simultaneously in federal court for class action certification and with regulatory agencies for criminal investigation. The evidence you've gathered provides comprehensive documentation of both civil and criminal violations, but Kim emphasized the importance of organizing additional franchisees to strengthen our case. The more victims we can identify and document, the stronger our position becomes in both litigation and settlement negotiations. Corporate fraud cases succeed when the pattern of abuse is undeniable. I spent the following month contacting every terminated franchisee I could identify through industry networks and professional associations. The response was overwhelming. Veteran owners who had felt isolated and defeated by corporate's actions were eager to join collective legal action against the systematic fraud that had destroyed their businesses. Within 6 weeks, we had identified 63 terminated franchisees across 15 states who had experienced identical treatment. Corporate's scheme was far more extensive than my initial investigation had revealed. Each franchisee had documentation of fabricated performance evaluations, modified renewal criteria, and territorial reassignments that benefited corporate insiders. The combined evidence created an overwhelming case against corporate management that would be impossible to defend in court. Have you ever discovered that your individual problem was actually part of a massive fraud scheme affecting dozens of other people? Sometimes personal betrayal reveals institutional corruption that requires collective legal action to address properly. The class action lawsuit we filed 3 months after my termination sent shockwaves through corporate headquarters and the franchise industry. Our legal team had assembled evidence from 63 terminated franchisees that documented the most systematic franchise fraud case in industry history. David Kim served as lead counsel, with Margaret Chen coordinating franchisee communications and evidence collection. The complaint we filed in federal court included over 2,400 pages of supporting documentation that proved corporate's systematic scheme to defraud veteran owners. Corporate defendants engaged in a multi-year conspiracy to terminate successful long-term franchisees using fabricated performance evaluations, modified contractual terms, and selective enforcement designed to transfer valuable territories to relatives and friends of corporate executives, the complaint stated. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Internal corporate emails, obtained through discovery motions, revealed explicit discussions about legacy franchise cleanup and territory optimization for strategic relationships. Corporate executives had literally documented their conspiracy to defraud veteran franchisees in writing. One email from Regional Director James Park to Corporate Vice President Sarah Mitchell was particularly damaging. The Rodriguez territory in Arizona is perfect for your nephew's portfolio. We can use the new compliance standards to justify termination and reassignment within 60 days. Another email from CEO Robert Hayes to Regional Manager Rick Davidson stated, "Priority should be given to family placements in high-value territories. Veteran franchisees who question policy changes should be moved to termination track immediately." These communications proved that corporate executives had been systematically targeting successful franchisees for termination while planning to award their territories to personal connections. The financial analysis we presented to the court showed that corporate scheme had generated over $53 million in benefits for insider recipients, while stealing established businesses from franchisees who had invested decades building successful operations. Corporate's immediate response to our lawsuit demonstrated their recognition of the case's strength. Within 2 weeks of filing, their attorneys requested settlement negotiations rather than proceeding to trial. "This is unusual for a major corporation," Kim explained. "They typically fight class action cases aggressively unless they know the evidence against them is overwhelming. Their quick pivot to settlement discussions suggests they understand they can't defend their actions in court. But we weren't interested in quick settlement negotiations that might minimize corporate's accountability for their systematic fraud. We want full discovery of corporate communications, complete financial restitution for all victims, and structural changes that prevent similar fraud in the future," I told Kim. "This isn't just about money. It's about stopping institutional abuse of franchise relationships." The Federal Trade Commission had launched its own investigation based on our complaint and supporting documentation. FTC investigators were examining whether corporate had violated franchise disclosure regulations that require accurate performance reporting and consistent application of contractual terms. The systematic nature of these terminations suggests possible criminal violations of federal business fraud statutes, FTC investigator Lisa Martinez explained. If corporate executives conspired to defraud franchisees using fabricated evaluations, they could face individual criminal charges in addition to civil penalties. State attorneys general in 12 states had also initiated investigations into criminal fraud charges that could result in prosecution of individual executives for conspiracy, theft, and fraudulent business practices. The media attention surrounding our case was generating additional pressure on corporate management. Industry publications were describing the case as the largest franchise fraud scandal in restaurant industry history. "Veteran franchisees expose systematic corporate theft," read the headline in Franchise Business Review. Internal emails reveal executive conspiracy to award territories to family members through fraudulent terminations. The negative publicity was affecting corporate's ability to recruit new franchisees and maintain relationships with existing owners who were questioning whether they might be next on the termination list. Corporate stock prices had declined by 18% since our lawsuit was filed, as investors recognized the potential financial liability and reputational damage from the fraud scandal. But the most significant impact was on corporate executives who were facing personal criminal liability for their documented participation in the fraud scheme. CEO Robert Hayes had hired separate criminal defense attorneys as federal investigators examined his role in directing the systematic terminations. Regional managers and vice presidents were similarly facing individual prosecution for their participation in the conspiracy. When corporate executives document their criminal intent in writing, prosecution becomes straightforward, explained federal prosecutor Jennifer Walsh. The emails and internal communications provide clear evidence of conspiracy to defraud that eliminates most defense strategies. The discovery process in our civil litigation was revealing additional evidence that strengthened both our class action case and the criminal investigations. Corporate's internal performance evaluation system contained two sets of data: accurate records that showed terminated franchisees had consistently exceeded standards, and falsified reports that were used to justify terminations. They literally maintained parallel documentation systems, Kim explained. Real performance data that proved franchisees were successful and fabricated evaluations that were used to steal their territories. It's a textbook example of systematic corporate fraud. The falsified evaluations followed identical templates with minor variations to create the appearance of individualized assessment while actually representing standardized fraud documents designed to justify predetermined terminations. Corporate had spent over $300,000 developing software systems specifically designed to generate fraudulent performance reports that could be used to terminate franchisees whose territories were desired by insider recipients. This wasn't opportunistic fraud, Kim noted. This was a sophisticated, technology-supported conspiracy that required significant corporate investment and executive-level planning. The premeditation makes the criminal charges much more serious. The evidence we had assembled was so comprehensive that corporate's defense attorneys were having difficulty developing any credible response to our allegations. Their only viable strategy is complete settlement, with structural reforms and executive accountability, Margaret Chen observed. They can't deny the documented evidence, and they can't defend the systematic nature of their fraud scheme. But we were determined to ensure that our settlement would not only provide financial restitution, but also create lasting accountability that would prevent similar abuse of franchise relationships in the future. Have you ever been part of legal action that exposed corporate corruption so systematic that executives documented their own criminal behavior? Sometimes, institutional fraud becomes so routine that perpetrators forget they're creating evidence of their own crimes. Corporate settlement negotiations revealed the desperation of executives who realized their documented fraud scheme could not be defended in court or explained to federal investigators. Their initial offers focused on financial payments that would minimize publicity and avoid admissions of wrongdoing that could be used in criminal prosecutions. They're offering $12 million for all class members, plus agreement to modify franchise policies going forward, Kim reported after the first settlement conference, but they want complete confidentiality agreements and no admission of liability. The offer was inadequate and strategically unacceptable. We had documented over $53 million in damages to franchisees, and confidentiality agreements would prevent other victims from learning about corporate's systematic fraud patterns. We're not interested in settlements that allow corporate to hide their crimes while paying partial restitution, I told the legal team. This fraud affected dozens of families who invested decades building businesses that were stolen through systematic deception. Our counter-proposal demanded $28 million in financial restitution, complete disclosure of corporate's termination practices, structural reforms to prevent future abuse, and cooperation with federal criminal investigations. Corporate executives who participated in systematic fraud need to face individual accountability, not just corporate financial penalties, I insisted. The settlement should facilitate criminal prosecution, not obstruct it. The Federal Trade Commission investigation was uncovering additional evidence that strengthened our litigation position while creating serious criminal liability for corporate executives. FTC investigators had obtained corporate banking records that showed direct financial transfers from company accounts to personal investments owned by the relatives who received stolen franchise territories. Corporate was using company funds to subsidize the franchise purchases by executive family members, FTC investigator Martinez explained. The insider recipients weren't just receiving valuable territories, they were getting corporate financial support that wasn't available to legitimate franchisees. This revelation elevated the fraud charges to include money laundering and misuse of corporate assets for personal benefit. CEO Hayes and Regional Manager Davidson were facing federal charges that could result in decades of prison time. The state criminal investigations were proceeding simultaneously with our civil litigation. Arizona Attorney General Patricia Williams had filed criminal charges against 3 corporate executives for conspiracy, theft, and fraudulent business practices related to the terminated franchisees in her state. The evidence provided by the class action plaintiffs demonstrates clear criminal intent and systematic fraud that warrants prosecution under state racketeering statutes, Williams stated. Corporate executives cannot steal established businesses from hard-working franchise owners without facing criminal consequences. Similar criminal charges were being filed in Nevada, Colorado, and Texas as state prosecutors recognized the strength of the evidence and the seriousness of corporate crimes. The mounting legal pressure was creating divisions within corporate management as executives began hiring separate criminal defense attorneys and considering cooperation agreements with prosecutors. Regional Director James Park was the first to break ranks, agreeing to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for reduced charges related to his role in the fraud scheme. Park is providing detailed testimony about the planning and execution of the systematic terminations, Prosecutor Walsh reported. His cooperation is filling gaps in our understanding of how the conspiracy operated at the highest levels of corporate management. Park's testimony revealed that the fraud scheme had been initiated by CEO Hayes as a strategy to reduce corporate costs while benefiting executive families through territory transfers. Hayes called it strategic franchise optimization, Park testified. The plan was to identify the most valuable territories owned by veteran franchisees, create grounds for termination using fabricated performance issues, then award those territories to family members and friends of corporate executives. The scheme had been implemented systematically across multiple regions, with regional managers receiving bonuses for successfully terminating targeted franchisees and transferring their territories to insider recipients. We had monthly meetings to review termination progress and identify additional targets, Park's testimony continued. Hayes made it clear that executives who didn't participate in the program would face career consequences. This testimony proved that corporate fraud wasn't limited to individual bad actors, but represented systematic institutional policy directed by senior management. The criminal implications were devastating for remaining corporate executives who had not yet secured cooperation agreements with prosecutors. CEO Hayes was facing federal charges that included conspiracy to defraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. The potential sentences exceeded 25 years in federal prison. Regional Manager Davidson was similarly facing multiple federal and state charges related to his role in coordinating territory transfers to benefit his son and other family members. The mounting criminal liability was creating additional pressure for corporate to settle our civil litigation on terms that would provide maximum restitution to victimized franchisees. Corporate's insurance carriers are pushing for settlement because the criminal investigations make their liability exposure essentially unlimited, Kim explained. When executives face prison time, corporate financial exposure becomes secondary to individual survival. Corporate's revised settlement offer reflected their recognition of the case's strength and the seriousness of the criminal investigations. They're now offering $23 million in total restitution, plus agreement to implement structural reforms that will prevent similar fraud in the future, Kim reported. They're also willing to cooperate with ongoing criminal investigations rather than obstructing them. The financial terms were approaching acceptable levels, but we wanted to ensure that the structural reforms would create lasting protection for franchise relationships. The settlement needs to include independent oversight of franchise terminations, mandatory disclosure of performance evaluation criteria, and whistleblower protections for franchisees who report abuse, I insisted. We also demanded that corporate establish a $5 million fund to provide legal assistance for franchisees who faced questionable termination attempts in the future. This settlement should create systemic change that prevents corporate from returning to fraudulent practices once the publicity dies down, Margaret Chen noted. The final settlement negotiations were complicated by the need to coordinate with multiple criminal investigations while ensuring that our civil resolution didn't interfere with federal and state prosecutions. But the evidence we had assembled was so comprehensive that corporate had little choice but to accept terms that provided substantial restitution and structural accountability. Have you ever participated in legal action that forced institutional change beyond just financial compensation? Sometimes, systematic fraud can only be addressed through comprehensive reforms that prevent future abuse of the relationships that enabled the original crimes. The final settlement agreement we reached 6 months after filing our class action lawsuit represented the largest franchise fraud recovery in industry history and established precedents for corporate accountability that would protect franchisees nationwide. Corporate agreed to pay $23 million in direct restitution to terminated franchisees, with individual payments ranging from $180,000 to $520,000 based on documented losses and territory values. My share totaled $340,000, which reflected not only my financial losses, but also recognition of my role as lead plaintiff in organizing the case. But the financial recovery was only part of our victory. The structural reforms we negotiated would fundamentally change how corporate managed franchise relationships and prevent similar systematic fraud in the future. Corporate agreed to implement independent oversight of all franchise terminations, with external auditors reviewing performance evaluations and ensuring that termination decisions were based on documented contractual violations rather than fabricated metrics. They established mandatory disclosure requirements for performance evaluation criteria, giving franchisees access to the specific data and standards used in renewal decisions. This transparency would make it impossible for corporate to modify evaluation criteria retroactively or apply standards selectively. The settlement included comprehensive whistleblower protections for franchisees who reported questionable corporate practices, with legal fee reimbursement and retaliation prohibitions that would encourage reporting of abuse. Corporate also agreed to establish a $5 million legal assistance fund to provide representation for franchisees facing questionable termination attempts, ensuring that future victims would have resources to challenge corporate abuse. This settlement creates systemic change that goes far beyond financial compensation, Kim explained. The structural reforms and oversight mechanisms will protect thousands of franchisees who weren't directly affected by this specific fraud scheme. The Federal Trade Commission investigation had resulted in additional penalties and regulatory changes that strengthened franchise disclosure requirements nationwide. Corporate defendants violated fundamental franchise disclosure regulations by providing false performance data and applying contractual terms inconsistently, FTC investigator Martinez stated. The penalties we're imposing will ensure that similar violations carry severe consequences for any company that attempts comparable fraud. The FTC settlement required corporate to pay an additional $8 million in regulatory penalties and submit to 5 years of enhanced oversight of their franchise operations. But the most significant accountability came through the criminal prosecutions that were proceeding against individual corporate executives. CEO Robert Hayes had rejected plea negotiations and was proceeding to trial on federal charges that included conspiracy to defraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. Federal prosecutors were seeking a sentence of 25 to 30 years in prison. Hayes directed the systematic fraud scheme from the highest levels of corporate management, Prosecutor Walsh explained. His documented communications prove criminal intent and leadership responsibility that warrant the maximum possible sentence. Regional Manager Rick Davidson had accepted a plea agreement that required complete cooperation with ongoing investigations in exchange for a reduced sentence of 12 to 15 years in federal prison. Davidson's guilty plea included detailed admissions about his role in coordinating territory transfers to benefit his son and other executive family members. I participated in a conspiracy to defraud veteran franchisees by fabricating performance evaluations and awarding their territories to relatives and friends of corporate executives, Davidson stated during his plea hearing. I understand that my actions destroyed the businesses and livelihoods of hard-working franchise owners who trusted corporate to honor contractual commitments. Regional Director James Park's cooperation agreement had resulted in a sentence of 8 years in federal prison, plus restitution payments to affected franchisees and permanent disbarment from franchise industry employment. The criminal prosecutions were sending clear messages throughout the franchise industry that systematic fraud would result in individual accountability for executives who participated in schemes designed to exploit franchise relationships. So the Hayes prosecution is being watched by franchise companies nationwide, Prosecutor Walsh noted. Corporate executives are learning that documented fraud schemes carry serious prison time that cannot be avoided through corporate settlements or financial penalties. The media coverage of our case had generated industry-wide attention to franchise abuse issues and prompted regulatory reviews of company practices across multiple sectors. Veteran franchisees win $23 million settlement in systematic fraud case, reported Franchise Times. Criminal prosecutions signal new era of executive accountability for corporate abuse. The negative publicity had forced other franchise companies to review their own termination practices and ensure compliance with disclosure regulations to avoid similar legal exposure. Industry associations were implementing new ethical standards and oversight mechanisms designed to prevent systematic abuse of franchise relationships. But the most personally satisfying aspect of our victory was the recognition that our collective action had protected countless other franchisees from experiencing similar betrayal. The evidence you assembled and the leadership you provided changed the entire franchise industry, Kim told me during our final settlement meeting. Thousands of franchise owners will benefit from the protections and oversight mechanisms that resulted from your willingness to fight systematic corporate fraud. The other terminated franchisees who had joined our class action were using their settlement payments to rebuild their businesses or invest in independent ventures that wouldn't be subject to corporate control. Tom Rodriguez was purchasing 3 independent restaurant locations in Arizona using his $310,000 settlement. Linda Morrison was opening a consulting business to help franchisees understand their contractual rights and recognize warning signs of corporate abuse. We turned corporate's betrayal into an opportunity to build better businesses without their interference, Rodriguez observed. The settlement gave us the capital and knowledge to succeed on our own terms. My own plans involved using the settlement funds to purchase independent restaurant properties that would generate income without franchise fees, territorial restrictions, or corporate interference in operational decisions. The experience had taught me that franchise relationships, while potentially profitable, created vulnerabilities to systematic abuse that could destroy decades of work without warning. Independent ownership provided control and security that franchise arrangements could never guarantee, especially when corporate management prioritized insider benefits over franchisee success. The industry changes resulting from our case would protect future franchisees, but my personal preference was avoiding franchise relationships entirely in favor of independent business ownership. Have you ever achieved victory that felt more significant because it protected other people from experiencing the betrayal you had suffered? Sometimes collective legal action creates changes that benefit far more people than those directly involved in the original lawsuit. The criminal trial of CEO Robert Hayes began 18 months after our civil settlement and provided the final chapter of accountability for corporate systematic fraud scheme. Federal prosecutors presented evidence that documented the most comprehensive franchise fraud conspiracy in industry history, with Hayes serving as the architect of systematic betrayal affecting hundreds of franchise owners. The trial lasted 6 weeks and featured testimony from dozens of terminated franchisees, corporate whistleblowers, and federal investigators who had uncovered the full scope of Hayes's criminal enterprise. My testimony as lead plaintiff focused on the systematic nature of corporate's fraud and the comprehensive evidence that had exposed their conspiracy to steal valuable territories from veteran franchisees. Mr. Hayes directed a multi-year scheme to fabricate performance evaluations, modify contractual terms retroactively, and transfer profitable territories to relatives and friends of corporate executives, I testified. The documentation we assembled proved that this wasn't opportunistic fraud, but systematic institutional policy designed to enrich corporate insiders through theft of established businesses. The prosecution presented internal corporate emails that showed Hayes had personally directed the identification of high-value targets among veteran franchisees and coordinated the fabrication of performance issues that would justify their terminations. One particularly damaging email from Hayes to his management team stated, "Legacy franchisees represent untapped value that should be redirected to strategic relationships. Develop termination justifications for the territories we've identified as priority reassignments." Another email revealed Hayes's personal involvement in awarding territories to executive family members. The Palmer locations in Colorado are perfect for Davidson's son. Ensure the performance evaluation provides adequate grounds for termination and territorial reassignment. These communications proved that Hayes had not only participated in the fraud scheme, but had originated and directed it as systematic corporate policy. The testimony from Regional Director James Park, who had accepted a cooperation agreement, provided devastating details about Hayes's leadership of the criminal conspiracy. Hayes established monthly meetings to review termination progress and identify additional veteran franchisees whose territories could be awarded to executive family members, Park testified. He made it clear that regional managers who didn't participate in the program would face career consequences and termination themselves. Park's testimony revealed that Hayes had implemented financial incentives for executives who successfully terminated targeted franchisees and transferred their territories to insider recipients. Regional managers received bonuses of $25,000 for each successful termination and reassignment, Park continued. Hayes called it performance management, but we all understood it was a reward system for stealing territories from successful franchise owners. The prosecution also presented evidence that Hayes had used corporate funds to subsidize franchise purchases by executive family members, providing financial advantages that weren't available to legitimate franchisees. Hayes authorized corporate loans and investment support totaling over $2.3 million to help insider recipients purchase the territories that had been stolen from terminated franchisees, federal investigator Lisa Martinez testified. Corporate money was being used to facilitate the transfer of stolen assets to executive family members. This evidence proved that Hayes's crimes extended beyond fraud and conspiracy to include money laundering and misuse of corporate assets for personal benefit. The defense strategy attempted to argue that Hayes had been following industry standards for franchise management and that terminated franchisees had legitimately failed to meet performance requirements. But the comprehensive evidence assembled through our class action litigation made these arguments impossible to sustain. The defendants maintained two sets of performance records, Prosecutor Walsh explained to the jury. Accurate data that proved terminated franchisees had consistently exceeded contractual requirements and falsified evaluations that were used to justify stealing their territories. The prosecution presented side-by-side comparisons of real performance data and fabricated evaluations for dozens of terminated franchisees, showing systematic patterns of falsification that could only have resulted from centralized direction. Hayes's own emails and internal communications had documented his personal involvement in directing the creation of fraudulent performance evaluations and coordinating territory transfers to benefit executive family members. The defendant's own words prove criminal intent and leadership responsibility for systematic fraud affecting hundreds of franchise owners, Prosecutor Walsh stated during closing arguments. He conceived, directed, and profited from a conspiracy that destroyed the livelihoods of hard-working business owners who had trusted corporate to honor contractual commitments. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all federal charges: conspiracy to defraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the clarity of Hayes's criminal intent, as documented in his own communications. Federal sentencing guidelines for Hayes's crimes indicated a prison term of 25 to 30 years, with no possibility of parole for the first 20 years. The judge also ordered complete restitution of stolen assets and forfeiture of all property acquired through criminal activity. Mr. Hayes's systematic fraud represented a betrayal of trust that affected hundreds of families who had invested decades building successful businesses, Judge Patricia Morrison stated during sentencing. His crimes were motivated by greed and executed through sophisticated deception that destroyed the financial security of hard-working franchise owners. The final sentence imposed 28 years in federal prison, plus restitution of $12.3 million to victims and forfeiture of all assets acquired through the fraud scheme. Hayes would be eligible for parole consideration after serving 23 years, but only if he demonstrated genuine rehabilitation and made complete restitution to all victims. At age 57, Hayes will likely spend the rest of his life in federal prison, Prosecutor Walsh noted. His case sends a clear message that corporate executives who direct systematic fraud will face consequences that match the severity of their crimes. The other corporate executives who had participated in the fraud scheme had received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years, depending on their level of involvement and cooperation with investigations. Regional Manager Rick Davidson was serving 12 years in federal prison after his cooperation agreement was rejected due to his continued attempts to minimize his role in directing territory transfers to benefit his son. The total criminal penalties and civil judgments against corporate executives exceeded $45 million, while the structural reforms implemented through our class action settlement had fundamentally changed franchise industry practices nationwide. The Hayes prosecution represents the most comprehensive accountability for corporate franchise fraud in industry history, FTC investigator Martinez observed. The combination of criminal prosecutions and civil reforms has created lasting protection for franchise relationships that will benefit thousands of business owners. The franchise industry had implemented new ethical standards, oversight mechanisms, and whistleblower protections that would prevent similar systematic abuse in the future. But beyond industry changes, the prosecution had provided personal vindication for the hundreds of franchisees whose lives had been disrupted by corporate's systematic betrayal. Justice wasn't just about financial recovery, Tom Rodriguez reflected. Seeing Hayes sentenced to nearly 3 decades in prison proved that corporate executives can't destroy people's livelihoods without facing serious consequences. Have you ever witnessed justice that felt proportionate to the scope of institutional betrayal you experienced? Sometimes criminal accountability provides closure that financial settlements cannot achieve, especially when executives' documented arrogance becomes evidence of their own crimes. Standing in my new flagship restaurant 2 years after the Hayes sentencing, I reflected on the journey that had transformed corporate betrayal into the foundation for greater independence and success than I had ever achieved as a franchisee. Palmer's independent kitchen occupied a prime location that I had purchased using settlement funds and loan financing secured by my restored reputation within the restaurant industry. The 8,000 square foot facility featured an open kitchen design, craft beer selection, and farm-to-table menu that reflected my vision for quality dining without corporate restrictions. My annual income had reached $340,000, significantly exceeding what I had earned as a franchise owner, while eliminating the fees, territorial restrictions, and corporate interference that had always limited operational flexibility and profitability. The restaurant employed 32 full-time staff members who benefited from profit-sharing programs and advancement opportunities that I could implement without corporate approval or standardization requirements. Working for an independent owner who values our input and rewards our performance is completely different from the franchise environment, my general manager, Sarah Collins, observed. You can see the difference in employee satisfaction and customer service quality. The business model I had developed emphasized local sourcing, community engagement, and operational excellence that created competitive advantages impossible to achieve within corporate franchise systems. Our customer satisfaction scores consistently exceeded industry averages, while profit margins remained high due to the absence of franchise fees and the ability to negotiate directly with suppliers and vendors. The experience of fighting corporate fraud had taught me valuable lessons about business relationships, documentation, and the importance of maintaining control over critical operational decisions. Independent ownership provided security and flexibility that franchise arrangements could never guarantee, especially when corporate management prioritized their own interests over franchisee success. But the most meaningful aspect of our victory extended beyond personal financial recovery to the industry-wide changes that had resulted from our collective legal action. The structural reforms implemented through our class action settlement had created lasting protections for franchise relationships that were benefiting thousands of business owners nationwide. Independent oversight of franchise terminations had virtually eliminated systematic abuse of veteran owners. Mandatory disclosure requirements had created transparency that made fraudulent performance evaluations impossible to sustain. Whistleblower protections and legal assistance funds had encouraged reporting of corporate abuse while providing resources for franchisees to challenge questionable termination attempts. The changes you helped create have fundamentally improved franchise industry practices, David Kim told me during our annual case review meeting. Systematic fraud schemes like Hayes directed are now virtually impossible to implement or sustain. The Federal Trade Commission had used our case as the foundation for enhanced franchise disclosure regulations that strengthened protection for franchise relationships across all industries. State regulatory agencies had implemented additional oversight mechanisms and enforcement procedures that created deterrent effects for corporate executives who might contemplate similar fraud schemes. The criminal prosecutions had established precedents for individual accountability that extended beyond financial penalties to include substantial prison sentences for executives who participated in systematic fraud. Corporate executives throughout the franchise industry understand that documented fraud schemes carry serious personal consequences that cannot be avoided through corporate settlements, Federal Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh noted. The Hayes case changed the risk calculation for potential wrongdoers. Industry associations had developed new ethical standards and professional oversight mechanisms designed to prevent systematic abuse of franchise relationships while promoting legitimate business practices. The media attention surrounding our case had educated franchisees about their contractual rights and warning signs of corporate abuse, creating informed constituencies that were better equipped to recognize and resist fraudulent practices. But the most personally satisfying outcome was hearing from other franchisees who had benefited from the protections and resources that resulted from our collective legal action. Linda Morrison had successfully challenged a questionable termination attempt using the legal assistance fund we had negotiated in our settlement agreement. The resources and oversight mechanisms that resulted from your case prevented me from losing my second franchise territory, she reported. Corporate tried to use the same fabricated performance issues, but the independent auditors exposed their deception before any damage was done. Tom Rodriguez had expanded his independent restaurant operations to 5 locations across Arizona, using the business model and vendor relationships he had developed after leaving the franchise system. Breaking free from corporate control allowed us to build businesses that reflect our own values and operational expertise, Rodriguez observed. The settlement provided capital, but independence provided opportunity. The other terminated franchisees who had joined our class action were similarly thriving in independent business ventures that generated higher income without corporate fees and restrictions. Many had used their settlement funds to purchase established restaurants, food service businesses, or related enterprises that benefited from their operational experience while eliminating franchise limitations. The collective success of class action members demonstrated that corporate systematic fraud had inadvertently created opportunities for veteran operators to achieve greater prosperity through independent ownership. Hayes thought he was stealing valuable territories from successful franchisees, Margaret Chen observed. Instead, he freed experienced operators from corporate restrictions and provided them with capital to build better businesses without franchise limitations. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. Corporate's betrayal had ultimately created opportunities for success that wouldn't have been possible within the franchise system that had constrained our growth and profitability for decades. Looking back on 21 years as a franchise owner, I realized that corporate's fraud had revealed both the vulnerabilities of franchise relationships and the advantages of independent business ownership. The systematic documentation that had exposed Hayes's crimes was an extension of the auditing discipline that had always guided my professional approach to business operations and financial management. Professional habits that colleagues had sometimes viewed as excessive attention to detail had become the foundation for justice, industry reform, and personal success that exceeded anything I had achieved as a franchisee. Hayes's attempt to steal my territory had instead eliminated the corporate control that had always limited my operational flexibility and financial potential. The 28-year prison sentence he received provided proportionate accountability for systematic fraud that had affected hundreds of families, while the industry reforms prevented similar abuse of future franchise relationships. Sometimes the most sophisticated institutional betrayal creates opportunities for justice and success that wouldn't have existed without the original crimes. Corporate executives who systematically exploit franchise relationships through documented fraud schemes ultimately provide evidence for their own prosecution, while freeing their victims to achieve greater success through independent ventures. The lesson for other business owners facing institutional betrayal is clear. Maintain comprehensive documentation, organize collective legal action when systematic abuse affects multiple victims, and trust that professional competence and ethical principles ultimately prevail over corporate fraud and executive arrogance. Hayes's criminal conspiracy had strengthened rather than weakened my position within the restaurant industry, while providing the capital and knowledge necessary to build independent businesses that generated higher income without corporate interference. The people who think they're eliminating successful competitors through systematic fraud sometimes end up creating the evidence and motivation necessary for their own destruction, while liberating their victims to achieve unprecedented success. Have you discovered that institutional betrayal ultimately created opportunities for independence and success that wouldn't have been possible within the system that originally constrained your potential? Sometimes, systematic corporate fraud becomes the catalyst for achievements that exceed anything the original relationship could have provided. If this story of collective legal action and executive accountability resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button to Revenge Tales with Luke. Share your experiences with corporate betrayal and systematic fraud in the comments below. Your story might help someone else who's facing similar challenges with institutional abuse and executive misconduct. See you in our next story.